What if the being who saved an entire civilization from starvation had never eaten a single meal in over 1,000 years? What if the most powerful force in a dying world was a forgotten skeleton who only wanted to tend his fields? His name is Ange, and by every measure that matters in the world of the undead, he is nothing. Lowest rank, lowest status, the kind of skeleton nobody looks at twice. He works a farm in a realm that the living forgot long ago, a place called the Undead Empire, and he has been doing it for over 1,000 years without stopping. No one told him to keep going. No one checked on him. No one cared. He simply kept farming because farming was the only thing his soul had ever known. Around him on that same stretch of land, 79 other dry bone skeletons did the same work. Each one was assigned 100 acres of farmland and left to manage it as they saw fit. Most of them did not manage it at all. They lounge in haystacks. They half-heartedly shoot birds away from the grain. They let the pests come, let the rot set in, let their bones decay piece by piece until movement became impossible. Within a decade, each one was reduced to a pile of useless remains. The higher beings above would notice eventually, send replacements, and the cycle would begin again. Ange was not like them, not even slightly. While others collapsed into the fields they were supposed to tend, Ange built shelters from straw to keep the sun off his bones during the day. He cleaned himself regularly, inspecting each joint, each socket, each rib for signs of wear. And whenever a fellow skeleton lost its mobility to decay, Ange picked it up and carried it home. Not out of sentiment, out of practical necessity. He had built a collection of spare parts, and when one of his own bones cracked or crumbled, he simply found a replacement from the pile. Swap it in, keep moving, get back to the fields. That was how Ange survived while every other skeleton around him turned to dust. He was not the strongest, not the cleverest, not the most ambitious being in the Undead Empire. He was simply the one who refused to stop. Then one winter, after more than 100 years of unchanged routine, Ange woke from hibernation to find everything gone. The wailing of the wraiths, silent. The patrols of higher undead vanished. Every companion who had once shuffled through the fields, gone without a trace. The farm itself had collapsed into ruin during his sleep. Ange stood at the edge of the overgrown fields and processed this information with the same calm. He processed everything. Then a thought struck him that delighted him completely. More skeletons must have rotted away, which meant more spare parts. He combed through every abandoned corner of the farm and collected exactly 79 skeletons. With those bones, he bought himself another 300 years. He kept farming the whole time, every harvest, setting aside seeds, storing the rest underground. The vault he had built was enormous, big enough that filling it alone would take another 1,000 years. But eventually, the last spare skeleton was gone, and for the first time in over 500 years, Ange had to leave the farm. What he found outside was not the Undead Empire he remembered. It was silence, complete, absolute, unsettling silence. He followed the silence all the way to the Palace of Rest, the seat of the Undead King himself. Forbidden ground for a farming skeleton of his rank. He walked in anyway. He searched for days. No one was home. Not a servant, not a guard, not the king. But he did find something useful. A pile of mostly intact skeletons near the palace interior. Among them were gray bone and white bone varieties, ranks far above anything Ange had ever touched. For a bottom-tier dry bone like him, this was a treasure beyond measure. He carefully selected the best pieces, assembled a complete frame, and transferred his soul into it. Just like that, Ange became a gray bone skeleton. He had hoped for silver bone, but his soul was too weak to power it. Gray bone was more than enough. He went back to the farm and got to work, and found that tasks which once consumed a full day now took 5 or 6 hours. In the leftover time, he studied the only other item he possessed of any interest, a scarecrow hat left behind from the old farm days, built to cast illusion magic. With just a small infusion of magical energy, it could hold an illusion for a very long time. Anyone without greater spiritual power than the caster could not see through it. It was a simple artifact, but in Ange's hands, over enough time, it became something he genuinely understood. He mastered several illusion techniques for disguising his appearance. He had no idea then how useful that would become. Another 1,000 years passed, the same rhythm, the same fields, the same underground vault filling slowly with grain. And then, on an ordinary day pushing a cartload of grain toward the storehouse, something caught his eye. A glowing white archway, had appeared just beyond the fence at the edge of the farm. Ange circled it several times, searching for whoever had built it. Nobody. So he stepped into the center of it, because that is what Ange does with anything unusual. He investigates calmly. A blinding flash swallowed him whole. When the light faded, he was standing in a gray, desolate wasteland he had never seen before. The jagged stone pillars stood nearby, glowing faintly. Then the glow transformed into a leather wristband and slipped neatly onto his wrist. A new world, a new object, and absolutely no explanation for either. Then a feeble voice came from behind him. A gaunt, emaciated human was lying on the ground, one skeletal hand pressed against Ange's foot. The man rasped out a single question in confusion, asking why a ghost had appeared instead of what he had prayed for. Then he went limp and passed out. Ange stood over him, baffled. The human had called him a ghost, but Ange was obviously a skeleton. Then he remembered. He had been wearing the scarecrow hat the whole time, projecting the illusion of ghost hair. He pulled the hat off, but the man was already unconscious. Ange studied the situation with the same methodical attention he gave to sick crops. Life force fading fast. Body obviously starved to the edge of collapse. He had a cartload of freshly harvested grain right there. Humans needed food. The solution seemed obvious. Ange flipped the man over and stuffed a fistful of grain into his mouth, then crouched beside him and watched. Nothing happened. After a long while, still nothing. It had not occurred to Ange that unconscious humans cannot swallow. So he tried harder, more grain, more persistence, until the man jolted awake and coughed out what had nearly choked him to death. The man managed to explain, gasping, that grain needed to be husked and cooked, and that without water he would die of thirst regardless. Ange considered this. Water. Where was he supposed to find water? He spent the entire day lost in thought about it, so absorbed in the problem that he completely failed to notice the man calling out for help, right in front of him, multiple times. In the end, the human sat next to a cart overflowing with food and starved to death. Ange was not cruel. He simply did not know. He had spent over 1,000 years farming food he never ate, in a world where no one needed to eat. He had no framework for what a dying human actually needed in time. He stood over the body, absorbing the lesson, and then turned to face a new problem. He had no idea how to get back. The wristband on his wrist gave no indication of how to reactivate the stone pillars. But the desolation here felt familiar, the same as the palace of rest after everyone had gone. Different world, same silence. Ange found that easy enough to tolerate. There were other skeletons here, at least. Dry bone types, shuffling aimlessly in the distance. When they drifted too close, one look at Ange's gray bone frame sent them running. His rank simply outclassed theirs by too much. By afternoon, every low-ranking skeleton in the area had redrawn its territory boundaries. None wandered within his radius again. Ange dug a pit, buried his grain in a separate hole, settled in. He had adapted to worse conditions than this over the past millennium. A new world with no instructions and no company was not going to unsettle him now. But the world, it turned out, was not done introducing itself. That evening, as the last light faded, the wandering skeletons in the distance all began digging holes and burying themselves simultaneously. And then the wind came. Not ordinary wind. This was the repose wind, the force at the root of all life in the land of death. It breathes into corpses and scattered bones and soul fragments, nurturing them into skeletons and undead. But it is not gentle. Show it disrespect and it destroys without mercy. For undead beings, prolonged exposure causes the soul to slowly congeal, wither, then fade into nothing. Even the mightiest golden skeleton king is not exempt. They simply last longer before the end comes. Ange lay in his pit, listening to the howl of it above him, and felt something unexpected. A cool, eerie calm settling into the flame of his soul. The repose wind, when it does not hit you head-on, has a soothing effect. Curious, Ange extended one finger out into the cold. The mist-gray wind swept over it, swirling into tiny vortexes, and his entire hand slowly turned a metallic silver-white beneath its touch. And then the sensation hit him, growth, the same feeling as consuming a soul. For a skeleton, the standard way to grow stronger is to devour the souls of others. Ange had never bothered with that. He was a farmer, not a predator. Growing his soul had never been a priority. But now that he had tasted it, he could not stop. He stretched out both hands and spent the whole night channeling that cold energy into himself. By dawn, when the repose wind died down, his soul had grown considerably more solid. His bones had changed too. Pits and cracks were gone. Larger holes had shrunk. Smaller ones had filled in completely. A few more nights of this, he thought, and he might not need to swap bones at all. That was when he noticed the human was gone from where the body had fallen. He looked up and spotted a small zombie shuffling unsteadily away in another direction. The man had died and been reborn from the influence of the reposed wind itself. Ange ran over and dragged him back. The little zombie screamed and struggled, convinced he was about to be eaten. But Ange only stripped him of his belongings, a leather satchel, an empty canteen, a long sword, a map, and a few silver coins, and then ignored him completely. The little zombie wandered aimlessly, stunned by this strange outcome. When the next reposed wind arrived, the newborn zombie had no defense against it at all. He dug frantically at the hard ground, trying to make a hole, nowhere near fast enough. So Ange pushed through the wind and dragged him back into the pit. The little zombie crouched at the far edge, trembling under the pressure of Ange's far superior rank. He howled. He tried to climb out. The icy wind drove him right back every time. Ange paid him no mind and reached his hand into the cold energy. By the next morning, the little zombie fled the pit at top speed, determined never to return. He made it about 30 meters before another wandering skeleton chased him straight back. That 30-meter radius was Ange's territory, and every creature in the area already knew it. Within those boundaries, the little zombie was safe. One step outside, and he was the softest target around. After being chased back enough times, he stopped trying to leave permanently. He came back to the pit before the next evening's wind even began. Same corner, same curled position, head no longer trembling. And gradually, something shifted between them. The little zombie began watching Ange with curiosity instead of fear. He even tried to imitate him, extending his own palm out of the pit into the reposed wind. The cold energy hit him like a physical blow and almost tore his newborn soul apart. But he survived it, and under Ange's shelter, he kept surviving. Week after week, the little zombie grew steadily stronger. He passed through his newborn phase and became a flesh-skinned zombie, the lowest zombie rank. The same rank as a dry-bone skeleton, but tougher, with greater defense and combat power. And his loyalty to Ange, though neither of them could quite name what it was already absolute. One day, the little zombie dragged a dry-bone skeleton to the pit and dropped it at Ange's feet. He nudged the skull toward Ange with visible eagerness, offering it as a gift. Ange shook his head. The soul inside was too weak. Absorbing it would grow him slower than a single night in the wind. The little zombie hung his head and dragged the skeleton away, crestfallen. Then he went out and made every dry bone skeleton in the surrounding area pay for the embarrassment. Not one escaped. He hunted them methodically from dawn until dusk, leaving empty frames scattered across the flatlands. His soul grew rapidly through all this relentless activity, even without the guidance Ange had given him. This quiet pattern might have continued indefinitely, but that was when everything changed. One day the little zombie came bolting back into the pit in full panic, shoving Ange frantically. A deep gash on his face, bone showing through, from something that had hit very hard. Ange poked his head out and saw it. A gray bone skeleton leading more than 20 low-ranking followers, charging directly into his territory. Gray bone against gray bone, no rank advantage, and with that crew behind it, the hierarchy rules everyone normally respected were being completely ignored. Ange assessed the situation in about 2 seconds and grabbed the little zombie. They ran. The gray bone skeleton and its squad gave chase across the wasteland. Once they were temporarily safe, Ange asked the little zombie through a soul projection what he had done to provoke this. The little zombie stared back at him blankly, not enough intelligence yet to form a coherent answer. Ange gave up and knocked him on the skull. If the little zombie had simply been chased on his own, none of this would have touched Ange. But he had run back here and dragged his only protector into the mess. That knock on the skull was deserved. Because of the little zombie's troublemaking, they spent several months living in shallow temporary pits, never secure, always moving. Eventually Ange dug a new pit, larger and more carefully constructed than the last. He tried keeping the little zombie in a separate hole with a connecting tunnel between them. Every morning he tossed him out. Every night he crawled back in. It became a kind of game. Ange was, by nature, easygoing. He had farmed without complaint for over 1,000 years. Being chased out of his pit did not upset him. He simply dug another one and moved on. He thought today would be like any other. But not long after the reposed wind began that evening, Footsteps approached and someone slid down into his pit. A human, middle-aged, weathered, in a traveling cloak, carrying an ornate staff. A powerful surge of magical energy radiated off him. This was a Mudge. The man spotted Ange with genuine surprise, then recovered himself and asked, almost casually, whether he minded sharing the shelter from the wind. He assumed, as most people would, that an ordinary skeleton acts on instinct and cannot hold a conversation. But this particular Midge was bold enough to walk through the land of death on his own. A skeleton did not intimidate him. He removed his hood and made room, and his ancient bone horse dipped its skull into the pit behind him. 3 beings in a hole barely big enough for one. Ange shuffled back toward the tunnel entrance to give them space. The Midge noticed the bone horse had been eroding in the reposed wind and pressed a hand to its skull. Black smoke rose from his palm and seeped into the bone horse through every opening, healing the decay as it went. Ange watched this with sharp attention. He had not seen magic used this way before. Then the Mudge slapped his forehead, muttered something to himself about losing track of time, and simply twisted the bone horse's skull clean off. Without a soul flame inside it, the body outside the pit was no longer affected by the wind. Crisis solved in about 4 seconds. This man was not someone who panicked. Cradling the skull, the Mudge gave Ange a sheepish grin and started talking, mostly to himself. He admitted freely that spending the long traveling alone with no one to converse with had given him the habit of talking to anything nearby. He called himself a merchant, a necromancer, someone who had walked this road more times than he could count. He told Ange about what this place used to be, the Golden Road, the great transit hub of the Undead Empire, once the busiest crossing point in the world. Now just a flat wasteland where small skeletons wandered aimlessly. He spoke of the underground city where he lived, full of people barely scraping by. He spoke of trying to buy grain from other settlements and being turned away every time. Then he said something that made Ange's hollow eye sockets flicker. He said the underground city had been hit by disaster again, and if they could not find a new food source soon, another wave of people would starve. He said he hoped the teleportation channel would reopen. He hoped the Undead Empire was still out there. He said it like a wish made to no one in particular, then pulled his cloak over himself and went to sleep. Ange sat in the pit and processed what he had heard. A world that needed food, and he had been storing grain in an underground vault for over 1,000 years. The next morning, the Mudge woke up and found Ange exactly where he had left him. He smiled and said, with what sounded like genuine warmth, that he hoped this quiet skeleton was still alive the next time he came through. Then he climbed out, reattached the bone horse's skull to its body, and began walking away. A few steps on, he turned back and introduced himself as traveling merchant, necromancer, wanderer of the Golden Road. He gave a slight bow and set off toward the flatlands. Ange watched him go. He stood there for a moment. Then, without fully understanding why, he climbed out of the pit and followed. Ange noticed almost immediately. He stopped. Ange stopped. He walked. Ange followed at the same fixed distance. It was, Ange realized, exactly what the little zombie had done with him. Without noticing it, he had picked up the habit. Ange laughed at that and shook his head and stopped paying Ange any attention. They descended the slope together, bone horse and Mudge and skeleton, with a little zombie trotting along behind as a 4th addition nobody had planned for. The lower-ranking skeletons scattered at the side of the bone horse. They moved unimpeded until they reached Ange's original pit. The gray bone skeleton that had chased them out weeks ago had found it and claimed it as its own. When it saw them approach, it crawled out, unhinged its jaw, and let out a soul-rattling shriek. A dozen lower-ranking followers emerged behind it, several of them with fresh dents in their faces. The little zombie's handiwork, almost certainly. The gray bone drew its bone blade. S stepped forward with a sweep of his staff. An invisible force took hold in the space between him and the skeletons. Soul flames were ripped from their skull strand by strand and drawn into his palm. He condensed them into 2 balls of soul fire, muttered an incantation to load a makeout, and flung them to the ground. The wraiths erupted upward and lunged straight at the gray bone skeleton. The gray bone cleaved through one and felt nothing happen. The wraith simply passed through the blade and merged back together. It latched on, clawed at the soul flame burning inside the gray bone's eye sockets. The gray bone fought back hard, destroying both wraiths with its bare hands. But that had cost it everything. While it was occupied, Ange had already stripped the souls from every single follower with a series of spells, pinning them in place. Shadow arrows pierced through eye socket after eye socket, shattering soul flames one by one. By the time the gray bone looked up to see what remained of its faction, there was nothing left but scattered bones. Esk finished it with a single ball of black flame aimed directly at the skull. The skull survived physically, everything inside it did not. The whole confrontation had taken minutes. Esk showed no excitement whatsoever. He had handled a minor errand. His expression said nothing else. They continued toward the stone pillars. When they arrived, Esk got to work. He pulled blue crystals from a pouch and pressed them into specific points on the pillars. Then he knelt before them and bowed with genuine reverence. The pillars began to glow, but nothing opened. No portal, no passageway, nothing. Esk circled the pillars several times, searching for what he was doing wrong. His disappointment was plain. He let out a long, heavy breath and began prying the crystals back out. As the crystals were removed, Ange noticed they had shrunk noticeably compared to when they had been inserted. He looked down at the wristband on his wrist. The magic had ultimately become this wristband, which meant the wristband might be the missing key, and the crystals were being drained each time Esk tried, which meant those crystals were the energy source. Esk walked past him on the way back, shoulders low, expression resigned. He said quietly that he had failed again, that maybe they should all start learning to live like Ange did. Then he noticed Ange was following again and laughed despite himself. He said, "Fine, if Ange wanted to come to the underground city, he could. The wilderness was too dangerous for a quiet skeleton anyway." He probably misunderstood why Ange was following. Ange was not interested in safety. He was interested in those blue crystals. Before they reached the pit, the little zombie spotted them from a distance and let out a howl of relief. He had woken up to find Ange gone and spent the whole time wailing outside the pit. When Ange appeared, the little zombie charged at him and refused to leave his side no matter what. So the group grew by one more. One human, one bone horse, one gray bone skeleton, one flesh-skinned zombie. A strange little group heading across a flat, desolate wasteland in one direction from morning until late afternoon. Then Esk stopped and said it was almost time for the reposed wind to rise, and the ground ahead, which had looked perfectly flat, suddenly revealed a deep gash in the earth, as if the land had been split open with a blade. Esk's face broke into a wide grin. They had made it. The underground city was just ahead. Inside the ravine, the walls blocked the worst of the wind. The air was almost still by comparison. Esk glanced back and told them to keep up, that the wind would blow them away if they were careless. Then slipped back into his habit of talking to nothing in particular. He explained that the ravine had once been a great river, that its water had seeped underground through volcanic rock and carved a massive cavity beneath the earth. That cavity was the underground city, the only reason anyone had survived here at all. Along the ravine's walls, shrubs grew in sheltered corners, moss clung to shaded rocks. Insects moved in the gaps. Then something caught Ange's attention, a black mist, nearly invisible, coiling around a stone ahead. As he looked at it, the mist stirred and slowly condensed into a human face. Esk introduced it casually as Blackface, the pet specter of someone called Old Warlock Phelan. The face turned its void-like eyes on Ange and the little zombie for a long moment, then dissolved back into mist. At the base of the ravine, a crack in the rock face served as the entrance, more than 10 meters wide, 4 or 5 meters tall. Standing at the entrance was a figure who looked exactly like a dried-out corpse, skin dull and shriveled and wrinkled, every trace of moisture gone. This was Old Warlock Phelan, city lord of the underground and the owner of the Spectre. Esk greeted him warmly from a distance. Phelan asked carefully about the grain run. Esk forced a smile and shook his head. Nothing. The other settlements would not sell. Phelan nodded with quiet disappointment and told Esk it was not his fault, that no one could sell food when their own people were starving. Then Esk mentioned the teleportation channel, still could not open it. The crystals had shrunk again. Phelan absorbed this without alarm and said quietly that it had been nearly 1,000 years since the channel had last worked. He said he hoped the Undead King was at peace and told Esk not to worry about the crystals. That crystals were not edible anyway. That gentleness was what made Esk's eyes redden. As he walked past, Esk mentioned offhandedly that he had brought back a quiet skeleton from the Sea of the Departed. He said the skeleton seemed to actually understand language, like it had real intelligence. Phelan's gaze drifted over to Ange with polite disinterest, until his eyes landed on the wristband. His entire body jolted. His eyes flew wide. His hands began to tremble. Esk had already walked through the entrance and missed it entirely. Phelan stumbled forward, reaching toward Ange's wrist with both hands, then caught himself and pulled back, visibly shaken. He stood there for a long moment, composing himself with great effort, then looked at Ange with eyes burning with barely contained hope and asked, barely above a whisper, "Are you the new watcher?" Ange tilted his head in genuine confusion, but to Phelan, that tilt looked like stern disapproval. He clapped both hands over his mouth and said nothing, murmuring that he knew nothing, had said nothing. His eyes, previously cloudy and tired, were now lit from within like someone had struck a flame. Esk returned from the entrance to find Phelan standing stiffly, and Ange watching him with hollow eye sockets. He told Ange not to worry, that Phelan was a good person, and that the soul suppression between undead beings would feel less intense over time. As long as Ange did not attack anyone, he could live in the underground city until his bones crumbled to dust. Esk led him through the entrance, and what lay on the other side stopped Ange completely. A vast underground space, gently sloping downward, with homes carved directly from the rock face lining the main roads. Oil lamps flickered along the roads, all manner of beings moved through them, talking and working. Minotaurs with great bovine heads, cave dwellers who walked on all fours, succubi and goat hide, goblins, humans, and filling nearly every labor role, skeletons and zombies, operating cable lines, carrying water, transporting goods in a steady, quiet rhythm. Ange watched all of this and felt, for the first time in a long while, something that resembled recognition, repetitive work, that he understood. Esk said his goodbyes at the entrance and stepped onto a wooden cable line that carried him across, toward the opposite cliff face. And just like that, Ange and the little zombie were left standing alone in an underground city full of strangers. But no one saw what was coming next. The little zombie immediately spotted a white bone skeleton carrying coal and lunged for it. With obvious intent, Ange grabbed him by the collar and stopped him in his tracks. Esk had said more than once not to attack others. Skeletons counted as others. The little zombie did not agree with this rule, but he could not argue with Ange's grip. Ange dragged him downward through the sloping corridors until the crowds thinned, and the pops grew quieter. Eventually, in some out-of-the-way corner of the sprawling city, Ange stopped. What stopped him was the soil, soft, fertile, moist. Over 1,000 years of farming had given him an instinct for earth that no instrument could replicate. He could read good soil at a glance. This soil was promising, but to wet and completely without sunlight. Even the farm at the Palace of Rest had sunlight. Down here, there was none, but growing on the rock walls nearby was a glowing moss, thin silver light pulsing softly from its surface. Ange tilted his head and looked at it for a long time. It had been months since he had planted anything. The farming instinct built into his soul stirred awake. No sun to hide from meant no need for a straw shelter. No repose wind meant no need to dig a pit first. Ange began gathering the glowing moss from the surrounding walls. While he worked, a violent argument was erupting in the underground city's council chamber far above him. The succubus Lena and the goblin Craig, two of the city's leaders, were tearing into each other. The cause was simple. Esk had returned with no grain, and the city was now staring at a life-or-death decision. Craig's position was cold and logical. Drive out a portion of the population now, while there was still time to be selective. Keep the high-value individuals. Let the others fend for themselves in the wasteland above. Lena called it heartless, inhumane, killing disguised as policy. Craig said he was not a person, so why would he have humanity? The food supply decided the numbers, not him. They went back and forth. Lena said they could work harder, burn the magic lamps longer, pull their energy together and pull through. Craig said, what about next year and the year after? This world was never built to support many people. They had only lasted this long on the wealth left behind by the Undead Empire's transit trade. Now that wealth was gone, this was where they had always been heading. Then Phelan spoke, and the chamber went silent. He said calmly that Craig's proposal was too cruel, but that if he were making the decision, he would recommend an undead calamity. Everyone froze. An undead calamity meant unleashing the undead to transform every living being in the city. In other words, killing everyone. Far crueler than expulsion, and Phelan was entirely capable of ordering it. Every undead being in the city answered to him. His word was enough to begin it. Lena searched desperately for an explanation, asking if he meant to reincarnate everyone as warlocks. Phelan shook his head. There were not enough materials for that. 3, maybe 5. Craig asked carefully what he meant then. Phelan asked them a question instead. What had been the underground city's greatest achievement in all its years of existence? Blank looks around the table. He answered his own question. Harmony. When the first inhabitants had arrived here, minotaurs were servants, succubi were slaves, and many species had been each other's prey. Phelan was old enough to remember it. He told them what starving people would do when the food was truly gone. They would look at their neighbors and see food. A chill passed through the chamber. Not one of them had thought of it. Phelan's voice stayed level as he described it. The calf next door, the goblins on a spit, the succubus hooves in a stew. Everything they had built here, the harmony that had taken generations to establish, would come apart in a matter of weeks. The warlocks and undead who survived would never believe in peaceful coexistence again. Better a calamity than that. Better a dozen souls reborn as warlocks in peace than 5,000 tearing each other apart. Then he delivered his final verdict. The food supply could last half a year. For that half year, no talk of expulsion, no plans of calamity. Everyone would eat their fill. Everyone would live with dignity. If no solution was found by then, they would all face the end together. Half a year, that was the timeline. After the meeting, Phelan went looking for Ange. The entire underground city was covered by his network of specter informants. Finding anyone was simple. When he arrived at Ange's corner, he found something he had not expected. Glowing moss, gathered and arranged in precise rows across the soft earth. The wrought walls around them already beginning to shimmer silver. Phelan stared at it for a long moment. He composed his expression and approached Ange with a wide smile and a slight bow. He said with genuine earnestness that he would not have come to trouble the Watcher if there were any other way. The World Transit Hub was closed. They could not buy grain. They had been holding on for nearly 1,000 years and had reached their limit. He wanted to buy grain. He hoped the Watcher would be willing to sell. He produced 10 black crystals and held them out carefully. Soul crystals, the universal currency among undead beings. He explained the old rate, 1 soul crystal for 200 jin of grain, and apologized that after 1,000 years the price had risen slightly. Ange took the crystals. The moment they touched his hand, he understood exactly what they were, not from thought, but from instinct, the same way a human sees water and knows it is drinkable. He pressed the crystals against the wristband on his wrist and began absorbing them. The vast majority of the energy flowed into the wristband. A small portion found its way into Ange's own soul. Almost instantly, the wristband lit up. Ange's consciousness was pulled away. When it gathered itself, he was standing at the archway near the Palace of Rest Farm. No body, just awareness, moving at the speed of thought. He thought of the fields. He was there instantly. Empty as he had left them, birds that used to circle, gone. Everything else, unchanged. He thought of Phelan waiting below, and something shifted. The grain sacks within his field of vision began disappearing one by one. 45 sacks vanished before the process stopped on its own. He returned to his body to find himself standing in the center of a ring of grain sacks, completely surrounded. Phelan stood just outside the ring, smiling so widely his eyes had disappeared. He called for a crew of skeletons immediately, and all 45 sacks were carried away in a single go before anything could change. When the area settled back to quiet, Ange turned Phelan's words over in his mind. 5 fewer sacks than the old rate. That matched the portion of soul crystal energy he had absorbed into himself. He checked his soul. It had grown slightly stronger. He filed the observation away and turned his attention back to the wristband, the farm, and what other ways this system might work. Stones could be transferred even when no crystal energy remained for grain. The remaining capacity was tied to weight. The farm had limits. He knew every corner of it after 1,000 years of walking it. But the Palace of Rest sat on the edge of his consciousness projection range, and he had never dared go deeper into it. Now, without a body to fear consequences, he tried. He willed himself forward toward the innermost section, the king's chamber of slumber. His consciousness hit something solid and was thrown back, a barrier, old, powerful, absolute. He turned without disappointment and drifted toward the eastern tower instead, the tallest of the 5 great building complexes. From the outside, it had always looked like a tall tower. From the inside, it was hollow from floor to ceiling. No floors, no divisions, just a cylindrical column of open space with a single small lectern at the very bottom. On the lectern sat a book made entirely of brass. Ange touched it, and it flipped open with a sharp snap. A massive apparition surged upward and filled the entire interior of the tower instantly. Now he understood why the tower had been built so tall. Without that height, the projection would have had nowhere to expand. The inner pages began showing golden characters, emerging one by one. Then a spectral brass dragon appeared, looking puzzled. It asked why there was a little skeleton here, and whether a little skeleton could even read. Ange nodded. The brass dragon complained briefly about the lack of class in narrating to someone who could read, then poured a stream of information directly into Ange's soul, the knowledge of written language, imprinted without effort. The brass dragon then remarked, puzzled, that his soul was quite powerful for a gray-boned skeleton. The text on the pages read, the brass book, all-knowing. One question may be asked per visit. You may ask what you do not know. Ange thought for a moment, then asked, who are you? The brass dragon nearly leapt off the page. In thousands of years of being sealed in this tower, no one had ever wasted their one precious question on that. Everyone who entered already knew who the brass dragon was, or thought they did. The dragon declared himself with great theatrical satisfaction, Negris, god of knowledge, the all-knowing. Ange stared at him for a long moment. Negris craned his neck and stared back. Then Negris admitted, visibly deflated, that there was a trap in that question that he had never successfully sprung, and that by learning his divine name, Ange could now call on him once a day with a new question. He said Ange had walked right into the trap, which was technically correct, though not because Ange had been clever enough to anticipate the reward. Ange simply had not known who Negris was. No calculation required. Negris urged him to ask another question immediately, eager to demonstrate the full might of the god of knowledge. Ange thought for a moment, then asked where the king had gone. The brass book snapped shut. The brass dragon's voice echoed through the tower in furious disbelief, announcing that of all the questions possible, Ange had chosen the one that Negris himself desperately wanted answered. He declared himself on strike and fell silent. Ange tilted his head and withdrew his consciousness without another thought. The brass dragon's tantrum had no effect on him whatsoever. He was a small skeleton. He had not had many questions to begin with. Before he could drift toward another section of the palace, his physical body was shoved. The little zombie, frantic, was shaking him and pointing urgently in one direction. Ange snapped back into himself and saw a flesh-skinned zombie shuffling toward them from a distance. Eyes rolled back, arms reaching. A controlled zombie. Someone was projecting their consciousness through it. Ange reached to his waist and drew his sickle. He did not know how to fight. He was a farming skeleton, but he had used a sickle for over 1,000 years. He knew exactly where to swing to cut cleanly and lay something down in a neat row. He swung once. The head rolled off the zombie's shoulders and came to a stop at the little zombie's feet. The little zombie clapped both hands over his own neck in alarm and stared at Ange's sickle with wide eyes. Somewhere in a dark corner of the underground city, a necromancer in black robes leapt out of his chair and grabbed his own neck by reflex. He had been projecting through the zombie. Everything it felt, he felt. It took him a moment to recover. When he tried to reconnect with the zombie, the link was completely gone. He muttered to himself, a sickle that sharp should not have moved that fast on a gray bone frame. He decided to find out personally. He went to a wall, pressed it in a specific pattern, and a hidden door swung silently outward. Behind it was a long narrow corridor lined with alcoves on both sides, each one containing a skeleton or zombie in storage. He selected a white skeleton with smooth high-density bones and walked it out under his control. He sent it toward where Ange had been. When he directed the skeleton to arrive, it found a headless zombie diligently hauling rubble behind Ange and a little zombie. Ange had put it to work. The zombie's soul resided in its chest, not its head. Losing the head had not killed it. Before the necromancer could process this, Phelan appeared in his path. The old warlock's face was livid in a way almost no one in the city had ever seen. He told the necromancer, through clenched composure, that he had been too lenient in cleaning out vermin like him from the corners. Then he reached out, and his face seemed to cave inward and begin to spin. A tremendous suction force dragged the necromancer's consciousness in, soul-devouring abyss. A mental magic targeting projected consciousnesses, success rate low, unless the caster's spiritual power vastly exceeds the target's. Phelan's spiritual power exceeded the necromancer's by more than 10 times. The consciousness was ripped out and crushed on the spot. In that dark corner, the necromancer's body slid off his chair and onto the floor, breathing. Alive technically, but the mine was gone and would not return. Phelan exhaled quietly and muttered that he had come too close to losing the Watcher. Before he had even begun, he declared the entire area off limits to anyone without good reason, and left without disturbing Ange at all. But something else had been noticed. In the moments of danger, the little zombie had clutched his neck in fright, and a wisp of soul energy had drifted from him into Ange. This had now happened twice. A mysterious bond, faint but unmistakable, had formed between them. The next day, Ange invoked Negris's divine name and described the bond. Negris's reaction was immediate and loud. He called it impossible. A soul bond, yes, but soul bonds form in specific ways, and none of them explained this. They could only form if Ange had granted the little zombie's soul, which he had not, or if the little zombie had made a soul oath, which neither of them knew how to do, or through the soul network, which required divine authority that Ange simply did not possess. Negris kept returning to the same conclusion. You are not the king. He told Ange to find an undead shrine and see if he could connect to the soul network. That would tell him more than anything Negris could deduce on his own. Ange found the little zombie's old clothing after pulling at his collar to look for answers, and discovered a name stitched inside. To their shock, the name of the human body the little zombie had been born from. Not his name truly, since the two shared no soul, but better than little zombie, less likely to cause confusion. The little zombie, seeing Ange pull at his clothing, immediately began stripping it off to hand over. Ange indicated he did not want it. The little zombie put it back on, leaving it more tattered than before. After that, Ange turned his full attention to the underground farm. He arranged the glowing moss in rows across the soft earth, hauled rubble to build raised ridges between them, and scattered seeds into the ridges with practiced precision. Over 1,000 years of farming had given him an instinct no instruction manual could replicate. Moss needed moisture, but could not sit in standing water, so rubble went along the bottom of the channels for drainage. Crops needed the raised ridges to stay out of the wet. Even rows meant every plant got its share of the light from the moss below. Whether the moss light would actually grow crops, he had no idea. He planted anyway. A week later, every seed had sprouted. Phelan came to see and stood staring at the silver-lit rows for a long time. In his mind, the Watcher would not waste effort on something pointless. If the Watcher had done this, glowing moss could provide light for crops, and if it could, the underground city's greatest barrier to food production had just been removed. He returned a few days later with 10 more soul crystals and asked, carefully, whether the Watcher would permit the city to use this method. Ange tilted his head. Phelan interpreted the tilt as displeasure and quickly produced an additional soul crystal, offering a usage fee of 1 crystal per month. Ange took it and nodded. He had started a habit from the first transaction, absorbing half a soul crystal worth of energy into his own soul with each exchange. The practice was making him steadily, quietly stronger. Then, remembering Negris's advice, Ange asked Phelan whether there was an undead shrine in the city. Phelan's soul jumped into his throat. He weighed his words very carefully and confirmed that yes, there was one in the southeast corner, though it had fallen into disrepair. He sent Ange the location through a soul projection and watched him leave with the little zombie. The shrine was at the edge of the main district, in a sloping area almost no one passed through anymore. The ground outside was blanketed in moss, slippery and cold, but the moment Ange crossed into the shrine's boundary, the moss and debris disappeared entirely. The floor had been swept spotlessly clean, and from somewhere further in came the steady sound of a broom working. Ange followed the sound and found a silver-white skeleton sweeping in slow, methodical strokes. Its soul strength was nearly the highest Ange had encountered in 1,000 years, just slightly below Phelan's. It should have exerted a rank-based pressure on anything nearby. Ange felt nothing. The little zombie pressed himself behind Ange and went rigid. The silver skeleton glanced at Ange once, then lowered its head and resumed sweeping. A broom that had lasted 1,000 years of constant use could only survive if it repaired itself. Looking more carefully, Ange saw the black mist rising from the bristles with each stroke. A soul armament, condensed from soul energy, capable of growing and repairing itself automatically. He called Negris. Negris projected into his soul, complained at length about being treated like a spirit butler on call, then confirmed there was no soul network in this shrine. He told Ange to light the undead flame on the altar first, then find sincere believers. Ange asked how to light the flame. Negris sighed, said he would just explain now rather than wait to be asked tomorrow, and guided him through it. A small infusion of soul energy into the altar, and the undead flame surged upward. The sweeping sound stopped immediately. The silver skeleton strode to the altar and knelt in textbook form, skull striking the floor with a resonant clang with each kowtow. With every bow, the small flame shot up another notch. Negris told him this was a priest, not a believer. He pointed out, with professional scorn, that a dull-witted silver skeleton could not talk anyone into anything. He told Ange to find real believers, then warned him that a skeleton approaching strangers would only put their defenses up. Ange put on the scarecrow hat and conjured the illusion of an ordinary-looking man. Not far from the shrine, he spotted a broad-shouldered Minotaur woman picking moss off the rock walls. He pointed at her and asked Negris if she would do. Negris said a stubborn Minotaur converting to the undead phase was harder than climbing to the heavens. He called it a waste of time. Ange took out a soul crystal, refined it, and transferred a sack of grain through the wristband. He placed it in front of the Minotaur woman and asked simply if she believed in the undead. The Minotaur woman had 3 children at home. Every one of them ate constantly, and she had run out of ways to feed them. The family had been reduced to picking rot-smelling moss off rocks. If any of them got sick on top of the hunger, that was the end. She dropped to her knees at the side of the grain sack and said she believed. She absolutely believed. She would kneel as long as necessary. Ange brought her to the altar. The undead flame blazed upward with every kowtow her head struck the floor. By the 15th bow, a pale blue flame drifted from her body and merged into the altar fire. That was the moment. The Minotaur woman, the undead flame, and the little zombie were suddenly linked into a single web. Negris called it cheating, said it was pure bribery. Ange pointed out that Negris himself had said sincere faith was all that mattered. Negris choked on his own argument. It was true. He had done the same thing when spreading his own faith, handing out prizes, giving small rewards to new followers. He regrouped and pointed out the more important problem. The soul network had transferred to Ange. But Ange was not the king. He had no divine nature. How exactly had he stolen the soul network? Negris had no answer, and something that Negris could not answer was, by definition, extraordinary. He told Ange not to leave, that conditions like these were ideal for rebuilding something significant. Ange told him he was almost out of grain. 1 soul crystal had transferred 5 sacks total, and 1 was already given away. 4 sacks left was not enough to do anything meaningful with. Negris pivoted immediately. He said that with enough believers, Ange would have more soul crystals than he could spend. Ange tilted his head and asked how many soul crystals it would take to transfer the brass book out of the tower. Negris fell silent. This blank-faced farming skeleton had just casually asked how much it would cost to possess the power of a god. Negris eventually admitted that when Ange's divine power was strong enough, it should theoretically be possible. Under the combined pull of that possibility and Negris's very direct encouragement, Ange agreed to keep gathering believers. He found the Minotaur woman again and told her what to say to her family. He told her to explain that the undead king had sensed the disaster and sent someone to save them. He told her that those who guided others to the faith would receive extra grain. The Minotaur woman's eyes were wide as brass bells. 3 children at home who ate like stampeding bulls. Believing in the undead meant eating to their heart's content. She did not need to convince them. The moment they heard about the food, all 3 charged toward the shrine at full speed. Their kodos shook the stone floor hard enough to loosen the tiles. The undead flame shot higher than anyone's head and kept climbing. 5 sacks from 1 soul crystal, minus the first sack, devoured entirely by 3 growing Minotaurs in a single sitting. But each Minotaur had offered at least 1 soul flame to the altar, equivalent in total to 4 soul crystals worth of energy. Probably a gain, Ange calculated, and began directing the undead flame's energy into himself. Negris watched this process and could not contain himself. He declared it deeply complex, something that took extended practice to master, and asked how Ange was completing it on the first attempt. Ange pointed upward and said it felt like guiding wind, like reaching his hand out of the pit into the repose wind. Negris felt quiet for a moment, then said nothing else about it. Word spread faster than anyone had planned. The shrine filled with people who had heard that sincere faith in the undead brought grain. The crowd nearly brought down the walls of the long-neglected building. The Minotaur woman and her family shouted themselves hoarse trying to restore order and failed. The silver skeleton reversed its broom, let the soul armament shift from cleaning tool to massive 2-handed cleaver, and leapt to the top of a stone pillar beside the altar. It arched its body and let out a cry that did not travel through air, but through soul. Everyone in the crowd felt something freeze deep in their chest, like a chill at the back of the neck, but dozens of times more intense. The crowd went still. Every person in it suddenly remembered where they were. An undead shrine, not a market stall, not somewhere to push and shout. White bones erupted from the ground around the open area and formed a fence encircling the shrine completely. They formed orderly lines and approached the altar one by one. And as each sincere believer kodoed, Ange felt them being woven into the soul network, one thread at a time. He could hear faint echoes of what was in their hearts as the connections formed. Most of it was "please give me food." A smaller portion was "please grant me immortality." And occasionally, more specific requests, complaints about neighbors, prayers to end the repose wind, small personal grievances offered up with complete sincerity. Living beings, Ange noted, had remarkably complicated inner worlds. The soul energy coming in through the network was now continuous and vast. He directed it into himself the same way he had always channeled the repose wind in the pit. And then, without warning, everything inside him changed. The soul flame contracted suddenly and intensely, all the fire rushing inward and forming a pulsing sphere. With each pulse, waves of pure soul energy surged through every bone in his body. Negris saw it and spoke with genuine astonishment, a soul heart forming. He said Ange's soul had been dense enough for a gray bone frame, for longer than either of them had realized. He said the bones would transform. Golden frame, golden skeleton king. That was the moment Ange understood that the being who had created him, the Lord he had farmed for without ever meeting, had been one of these. In the council chamber above, the underground city's leaders were arguing again. This time it was about the shrine itself and the grain it kept distributing. Lena proposed blocking believers from attending, worried about a destabilizing new factor in the city. The moment the words left her mouth, Esk erupted. He was a necromancer. Every necromancer worshipped the undead. Was she proposing to shut him down too? Lena realized with horror that she had also forgotten who the city lord was. Phelan was an old warlock, himself undead, proposing to close an undead shrine in his city. She wanted to take the words back before they had finished leaving her mouth. Phelan said she had only meant well, and that the shrine's reopening might be the most stabilizing force the city had seen in years. The grain it distributed eased the food crisis. That alone was a tremendous benefit. Treat it as if nothing unusual is happening and leave it alone. Craig allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He had suspected for some time that Phelan's sudden grain procurements and the shrine's reopening were connected. He had been right. He usually was. Phelan then raised the other proposal, using glowing moss as a supplementary light source for crops. Craig said it had been tested and had failed. The moss could not survive close enough to the crops without flooding them. He said flatly that the method was not viable and advised Phelan not to be taken in by anyone who claimed otherwise. Phelan said, simply, that he had seen it work. Craig said the method was impossible. A goblin engineer does not concede technical impossibility to anyone. He suggested that perhaps someone had used magic to fake short-term results, an illusion of growth sustained just long enough to be convincing. He said with professional confidence that Phelan should not be deceived. Phelan looked at him quietly and said nothing for a moment. Then, in a dark corner far below the council chamber, a weak-old necromancer's body jerked upright from the floor. A red flame ignited on the top of its head, eyes opened to reveal solid black pupils with no whites. The twisted horns began to grow from the forehead. A low, resonant voice said that useless trash could not even collect a body without being discovered, and that the noble Lord Demas had been forced to come handle things personally. The horns retracted, the pupils returned to normal, even the livid patches on the skin vanished. The body flushed back to the color and elasticity of the living, straightened itself out, and walked quietly out the door. The demon Demas was now moving through the underground city, wearing a dead man's face. He made his way through winding tunnels to a chamber lined with hundreds of stone coffins. He emerged from one and began to move with purpose. None of the city's leaders knew he was there. Below, Ange was still in the shrine, feeling the soul network pulse through him like a second heartbeat. 200 steady believers out of a population of 5,000. After natural filtering, the count had settled there, a respectable number. Around 20,000 jin of grain had been transferred through the wristband over several sessions, enough to sustain the shrine distribution for some time. Not everyone had been sincere. Those who were not simply did not come back. The ones who remained were the ones who had felt something real when they knelt before the altar. And that mix were people praying for food, for long life, for small personal things. And all of it flowed through the soul network into Ange, and from Ange into a soul that was now actively transforming. The golden frame was not yet complete, but the process had begun and nothing was going to stop it. Phelan, returning to the southeast corner after the council meeting, felt the quality of the soul energy in the area and paused. He said nothing. He simply stood at the edge of the shrine boundary and bowed his head once with great respect, then withdrew quietly. The little zombie, sitting near the altar watching the believers come and go, tilted his head at Ange. Another wisp of soul energy drifted from him and merged into Ange's growing flame. The bond between them was strengthening with every passing day. Whatever it was that connected them, it went deeper than rank or command. The little zombie had chosen it himself, in a way that could not be explained by logic or hierarchy. Even Negris, the god of knowledge, had no clean answer for why. Outside in the wasteland above, the reposed wind howled through the night as it always had. But inside the ravine, inside the stone walls of the underground city, something had shifted. Grain was flowing in through a channel no one had been able to reopen in 1,000 years. Light was growing in corners where nothing had grown before, and the being responsible for all of it was a former bottom-tier farming skeleton who had simply never stopped working. He had not come here to save anyone. He had followed a merchant because the merchant had blue crystals. He had planted moss because the soil looked good. He had lit the undead flame because Negris told him it might answer a question. He had given grain to a hungry Minotaur woman because she was hungry, and he had grain. None of it had been strategy. None of it had been heroism. It had all simply been Ange, doing what Ange always did, paying attention, not stopping, adapting to the next thing in front of him. In the council chamber, the half-year countdown was still running, but the arithmetic was changing. Grain being distributed through the shrine was already reducing the pressure on city reserves. The glowing moss farming method, once it spread across the city's unused corners, would reduce dependence on outside supply entirely, and the soul network connecting to 100 believers to a gray bone skeleton, standing on the edge of becoming something much greater, was still growing. Demas was somewhere in the tunnels below, wearing a borrowed face, moving toward something none of them had yet detected. That threat was real. It was coming, but it had not arrived yet. For now, there was only the steady pulse of the soul heart forming in Ange's chest, and the silver glow of the moss rose, and the sound of believers filing quietly through the shrine. Phelan had called this a disaster. Craig had called it the end. They had both been calculating correctly with the information they had. They had simply not known about the underground vault. They had not known about the gray bone skeleton who had been filling it alone for over 1,000 years. They had not known that the wristband on his wrist was the key to a transit channel that everyone else had been failing to open. They had not known any of it because Ange had not known to tell them, and because no one had thought to ask a farming skeleton what he kept in his storage. The brass dragon Negris, sealed in the eastern tower of the Palace of Rest, had gone quiet after the soul heart formed. Not silent out of sulking this time, silent out of something closer to awe. He had been sealed in that tower for longer than anyone still living could remember. He had answered questions from kings and generals and gods. He had never, in all that time, encountered a being who walked into his library not knowing who he was, who asked the one question that unlocked a daily audience completely by accident, who then used the audience to ask about grain transfer weights and moss farming and undead shrine procedures. The god of knowledge, it turned out, had never been treated quite like a practical reference guide before. He found, to his own considerable surprise, that he did not entirely mind. Down in the underground city, the silver skeleton had put the broom away. Not permanently, just for the night. It stood at the altar instead, one hand resting on the edge, soul flame burning steady and clear in both hollow sockets. It had swept that shrine for 1,000 years waiting for the flame to light again. Now it had. The little zombie, Zitterschach in name, though not in soul, had found himself a corner near the altar and settled in. He was no longer the terrified newborn who had scrambled away from Ange's pit in the mornings. He was something else now, something that did not have a clean name yet, stronger, more deliberate, and tied to Ange through a bond that even the god of knowledge could not fully explain. Ange stood at the center of all of it and felt the soul heart pulse. He did not think about destiny or power or the weight of what was coming. He thought about the underground vault back at the farm, still mostly full. He thought about the fields, empty now, that could be planted again. He thought about the moss rows he had started in the corner of the underground city, already sprouting. There was work to do. There had always been work to do. That was, in the end, the one thing about Ange that had never changed across 1,000 years and worlds. He was not a warrior. He was not a king. He was not even particularly remarkable to look at. He was a farming skeleton who had refused to stop in a world that had given him every reason to. And somehow, without planning it, without wanting it, without even fully understanding it, that had become enough to save everyone around him. The soul heart pulsed once more, steady and slow, like a seed pushing upward through dark soil. The golden frame was coming. The transit channel would open again. The underground city would not end in calamity or in cannibalism or in silence. Because 1,000 years ago, a small dry bone skeleton on a forgotten farm had decided that as long as he still had bones that moved, he was going to keep tending the fields. And he never stopped.